for today, this morning. Introduction to Portuguese politics from Miguel Silva. Good morning to you, Miguel. How are you?
Good morning, Carl. I'm very good on this sunshiny day.
It is beautiful. Where are you? Which part of Portugal are you in?
I'm just in Lisbon.
Just in Lisbon. You can't say that. Lisbon, the great cultural, one of the great cultural capitals.
Yes, but everyone knows Lisbon. It'd be far more exotic if I were in the countryside like you.
Yes, fair play, fair play. Do you have a country residence as well, as most Portuguese people do?
I'm proud to say that I'm not from Lisbon. I was born. I was born in Coimbra.
Yes,
I'm sure you know, and I was raised in Bragança, which is in the northeast, a small town.
Wonderful, wonderful, wonderful. So what? I guess we should whisper this, but you're from real Portugal, right?
What the Portuguese would say, deep Portugal.
Okay, that's nicely put. Deep Portugal. What beautiful places! And I guess if you are, if you have Coimbrian and Bragançanese connection, you would soon distance yourself from Lisbon. It's funny like that. So I've noticed so far. Thank you so much for being here. Thank you for responding to that call. We don't know about Portuguese politics as well as we might. I think a lot of the nuance of it. It depends on how well you speak Portuguese when you're watching these things and growing up steeped in it. If I'm on a bus, for example, in London, I can hear what everybody's saying. I can hear them complaining about politics. If I'm on a bus in Lisbon, I don't really know what's going on. People are speaking so colloquial, everyday Portuguese very quickly, and I can't pick up on all those nuances. It's not that much better when I'm watching TV. So thank goodness you're here to break it down for us. So where do we begin in our understanding, the beginner's guide, the children's guide almost to Portuguese politics? Where would we begin, at the top or the bottom?
I thought I'd share a small graphic that shows the semi-presidential system.
Great.
Let's see if I can manage this share button.
Well, you're a brave man. Many people come and share, but take your time, do what you have to do, and I'll speak to a few other people while you're doing that. So no pressure there. Alô a todos e bom dia, alegria de laria, from Andy the Doc Thompson, who's going to Coimbra, I think, at some point today, in fact. And I can add your graphics there. Perfect. Yes, how amazing! How very thorough of you as well.
I made an effort.
Yes, indeed.
So, so it's a semi-presidential system, and it's important to understand this for those, especially who come from America or, presidential systems, which means that, in short, the prime minister controls the government and the executive, but the president is the head of state, which means that many of the laws have to go through him. He has to approve them. And he is also the supreme commander of the armed forces, the military. Mm-hmm. You have I'm afraid it's in Portuguese. I could not find anything in English, but you see there the head of state. He is elected directly, whereas the government is basically people vote for a party. They don't vote for the name of a person. And it's then that party that chooses whoever becomes prime minister, the MPs in parliament, etc. But it would be a parliamentary system entirely were it not for the head of state being given sort of a supervisory role in the system.
Fascinating. Okay, and is it all right for me to interrupt you and ask you questions as we go? Or
of course, please do.
And what are the origins and when did this formally begin, this particular style of system that we have here now today?
Well, back in the First Republic, so after 1910, monarchy ends, the Republic is introduced. The problem was that in the early years of the Republic, the presidents had sometimes disproportionate amount of power. The system was very unstable at first. And so eventually this sort of system was agreed upon. Now, during the dictatorship, this was the system, except that it was only formally the system. Informally, of course, Salazar, even though he was prime minister, he had all the power, he had absolute power. But even during dictatorship times, formally, the president did have some powers, although he wouldn't exercise them.
Mm-hmm. Okay. So we're talking about a fairly recent development.
I would say it's been working like this in a stable fashion since the revolution. Yes.
Amazing.
So since 74.
Yep. Okay, that's great. Thank you.
Yeah. Social.
Oh, I've lost your presentation now. Is that the only one you want to share with us?
Plenty of things, actually. I mean, I've prepared a few things, but let me.
I will give a few more.
It's mostly history, and then as people begin to ask questions, I'll just.
Yes, of course. There is one question already in, and I will keep us up to date with the greetings that are coming in as well. Paul, hola, bon dia, from a lovely Cabanas de Tavira today. Can I ask about the history of the left bloc, and is it a pattern for others to follow? I mean, you don't have to answer that straight away, but if we can factor that in at some point, that'd be great. Andrea and Omar are here. Hello, good morning to everyone. This is a very interesting topic. So there's certainly an appetite for what we're talking about this morning and for a deeper understanding of what's going on politically in Portugal. Bon dia, alegria from a sunny Brixham in the UK. And Andy, looking for the dubious pleasure of being the most political person here, except perhaps our guest. So we'll give that award to you for the time being, for sure, Doc. And his favourite phrase, Miguel, I don't know if you agree with this, is if you don't do politics, politics will do you. Hence the importance of understanding of what's going on politically.
Well, there's certainly a lot of truth to that. Yes.
Okay, so we have this. We've got the broadest picture here, and those are the characters we're familiar with. I think as expats, tourists, and foreigners. We know Marcelo, as he's affectionately known, sometimes not affectionately known, but we know the president, and we know Antonio Costa, the leader, and they have been the I suppose the dynamic duo of the recent pandemic times, offering leadership through this, and are thought to have done a fairly good job. Obviously, in the world of politics, you're never free of criticism, but in terms of the world picture, they've done a fairly good job, with pressures from the population, with pressures from Brussels, and whoever else the pressure comes from politically. Are you going to tell us as well about the broader picture of the political parties this morning? Because I think that's what left bloc has been mentioned there. That's the fascination I have, and the bit I struggle to understand. How we're broken up into political parties, and what the political chamber is like in Portugal.
Well, the political chamber is easy enough. There's only one of them. We don't have a Senate, so it's fairly straightforward. People vote. The vote is more or less proportional in attributing mandates, and then because there's only one parliament, the parliament, basically whoever controls most seats in parliament controls the government, gets to form a government. I will share with you the result of the first election in Portugal.
First ever?
Yes. After the revolution.
Okay, so we've got a sort of post-revolutionary context here. Oh, okay. Yes. So very quick question before we move on from the early days here. But Merrill and John Smith are saying, I'm really interested in this. Was Salazar technically the prime minister then? Because I mean, he's characterized in historical terms, culturally, as the dictator, but also that was his actual position, was prime minister.
Yes, he started out as, he was invited. There was a military coup that overthrew the civilian power, so the military took power. They invited relatively early on Salazar to be the finance minister. His expertise was, he had studied law in Coimbra. He was a brilliant student, but I think he specialized in financial law, something like that. And so he was invited to be the finance minister. He was not given enough power to basically turn the economy around, so he quit. And then he returned again through the invitation of the military to become the finance minister. Then he would very quickly rise to the head of government. At the time, it was called President of the Council of Ministers. He was prime minister, effectively. And he would rule as prime minister for the remainder of his tenure, even though, of course, elections from then on were not particularly relevant.
Yes. Wow. Okay. And it's kind of hard to get your head around that, isn't it? and for that to be a phenomenon in such recent times in history as well. But I guess that takes us a little bit away from our subject for the time being, although, you know, people may wish to return to the fascination about Salazar. Sorry, I've lost your screen share again there. You were showing us a political pie chart.
Again.
Yeah, go for it. Bon dia, Carl. We're having our 5th barbecue of the year this evening. Typical Brits. 5 days of good weather, and then obviously 5 barbecues in a row. Loving this weather, loving this country. Good topic, also, by the way. So here we go. Here's the makeup of the first election.
So this election took place in 76. In 74 was the revolution that overthrew the dictatorial regime. In 75, we had what we call the hot summer because tensions were high and we were on the verge of a civil war. And then finally, everyone agreed at the end of the year to forego any military options and go straight to the elections. And so in 76, this was the result.
Could you lift that off the page for us and tell us who the colours are for those who might not be able to zoom in that closely? Oh, excellent. Wow, you've done it.
Yeah, good. So it's actually interesting to see this because the system remained roughly the same for the next 30 years. It didn't change much. So one of the problems with the hot summer of 75 was that the communists had been the only organized party during dictatorship years. They were a clandestine party, but they were organized. They had people everywhere. And then the remainder of the political system was either exiled or they were part of the system, but they didn't really have much power. So you see here the orange PPD or the blue CDS. They were people who came from, say, a Christian democratic background. And during the dictatorship, they were in parliament, but there was only one party in parliament, and they formed what was known as the liberal wing of that parliament or that party, because they advocated for actual democracy. The others, many people, the leader of PS, the Socialist Party, he was in exile, and the communists had been the only organized party. So in 75, they wielded a disproportional amount of power and influence comparing to how many people actually wanted them to form government. And that was the source of the tensions, because the communists were not that eager to have elections, and the socialists and everyone else were, because they knew they would get more votes.
Yes. And this is the beginning of what we understand today as the party. So could you break down those acronyms for us? That would be really helpful. And
Sure.
then if we might, I mean, the country looks so sort of politically set, doesn't it? When you look at the picture on the right, you get to see where the strongholds are of these political convictions and beliefs. But yes, please do tell us. So UDP, PCP, PS, PPD, and CDS, what do they stand for? And could you sort of elaborate a little bit more on their values?
Of course. So let's start on the left. PCP is very easy. It's the Portuguese Communist Party. The acronym works in English as well. They were a communist party. They were of the Marxist-Leninist school, and they still are.
You hasten to add, yes.
On the left of the PCP was UDP. UDP were far left, but they were not. You see, even in the 70s, there were some, let's say, dissension relatively to the Soviet Union. So the PCP would pretty much do whatever Moscow would tell them to do. But there were many Marxists that were not aligned with the Soviet Union. And there were many different, there were dozens of parties in 76. But the UDP was the only far left party other than the communists to manage to get elected. And the people who were part of UDP would later form the left bloc. So there has always been a far left Trotskyite, non-Leninist version of communists in parliament.
Wow.
To a greater or lesser degree.
Yes, like in UDP is what, ultra direito portuguesa or something along those lines?
No.
Right.
No, the Portuguese Democratic Union, but
You did say it. I beg your pardon. Yeah. Okay.
Anyway, many of these names are euphemistic. So, I don't think that UDP at the time was particularly democratic, but well,
Okay.
there they were. And the biggest party there, and consistently throughout this regime, the Third Republic, has been PS, which is a socialist party. They're pink because their symbol was for a long time the rose. It's either the fist, the socialist fist, or the rose, and so their color has been seen as this pink. Their leader came from the exile. He was a lawyer who used to defend people who were persecuted by the dictatorship. He was then, with political tensions, he was forced to flee. But he founded the Socialist Party in Germany in exile. And when he came back, he brought with him many of the people, many of the structures that he had formed abroad. And so it was relatively easy for PS to not only run for election, but win the election.
Wow. Thank you. Sorry,
to the right of PS, you have PPD. The People's Democratic Party. It would later change the name to PSD, which you do know today.
Yes.
So they're still there. In Portugal, they were called at the time centre-right, along with CDS. But of course, even supposedly right-wing parties had to be socialist in some fashion. Otherwise, they were fascists. You were either socialist or fascist after the revolution. People did not have much tolerance for anything even remotely resembling Salazar. And so PSD is the Social Democratic Party, and CDS is the Democratic Social Center. So they all have to be social in some form in order to exist. But they are, in the Portuguese context, what is considered to be the right wing.
Yes, yes. What an amazing time of history, and to be alive in Portugal. Edmundo saying here, our taxi man Edmundo, and I think you can always get forthright political views from a taxi driver. After 1976, creation of political parties ensured all citizens a social protection, ensuring the Portuguese with social, educational, and health security. So that to me sounds like a valid and appropriate analysis of what went on there, moving from dictatorship into a bright new future for Portugal. That's how I would imagine it was. Was it actually like that, or was there still this this great sense of heat, both in terms of the weather and in terms of the political temperature?
Yes, well, tensions decreased, even though throughout the 80s there were still tensions, and there was an active terrorist group in Portugal known as FP25, the Protection Forces of the 25th of April Revolution, and they killed a few people, even back then. But there was no more danger of civil war, which was the most important thing. As for the social reforms, yes, one cannot say that the social security and healthcare systems began with the Third Republic, but the Third Republic greatly expanded them relatively to the dictatorship. Of course, many of the most important schools, universities, and hospitals were built during the dictatorship. So it's a system that has been progressing over the years.
Interesting. And we've not heard anything about the monarchy that had been, I suppose, vanquished or washed away 70 years before that time. But some of the countries in Europe are monarchies, and the difference between them is, I think, yeah, I remember just making the point about monarchies there. Was there any wish for some to bring back a monarchy, or was that seen as too much of a sort of single party mentality, or a leadership that wasn't wanted at the time, and a much more social basis was required?
You mean after the revolution?
Yeah, I mean, because it's fascinating to hear of these leaders in exile. And I was going to ask you, where were they? Which countries were they in? Which countries were supporting them to come back to Portugal with their eye on Portugal? As a neighbour or as a fellow European country. You said one leader was in Germany, presumably being helped by all sorts of other states. Was there a monarchy party, or were there the descendants of the king from earlier in the century waiting to come back into the scene, or was that just totally out of fashion by that point?
No, no, no. No, not really. The monarchy was overthrown in 1910, and even before that, the king and the prince heir had been murdered. So the country was very heavily Republican, but most importantly, the armed forces were very Republican.
Okay.
So even during the dictatorship times, you'd think, naturally, dictators are not particularly fond of having a permanent parallel power to their own, even if it were to be formal and a figurehead. So already Salazar would not be particularly inclined to have the king come back, even though he was very close to some members of the royal family.
Wow.
But on top of that, the armed forces were Republicans, so there was really no question of ever bringing back the king. What Salazar did do, he allowed the family to come back. They were returned some of their properties. They were allowed to bury the kings that had died and the family members that had died in exile, because the First Republic was quite authoritarian at times, and they were very persecutorial of the monarchy and of monarchists. So Salazar relaxed all of that, normalized relations. But look, the Revolution 74 was very much Marxist inspired. So anything pertaining to conservatism, monarchy, right wing was very much out of the question. Now, there was a small party that was founded after the revolution, called the People's Monarchist Party, and they're still around.
Are they?
They have in a few municipalities some councilmen, but they've only very, very intermittently had MPs, one or two every now and then, but they're not a major political force.
Fascinating. And what an incredible move from Salazar. So do you think, the political motivation for making those terms with the members of the royal family? Was that a sort of populist move, or did he have a sort of was it a cynical, or did he have a kinder side of any kind?
No, I just think that he came from a conservative, traditionalist, right-wing intellectual milieu, and so the monarchists were very influential there. And he was a nationalist and a patriot, and I think he saw the royal family as completely part of Portuguese history. It wouldn't make much sense that if he were praising Portuguese history, the Portuguese Empire, that he would be dismissive of the monarchy.
Yeah, so it's not a revisionist or anything like that. Not he was able to embrace the past, but see the world in his own way.
He was a pragmatist. He was a ruthless pragmatist, like all dictators are.
Yes, yes, and I mean, the thing that I think I know about him was the smart move made in the Second World War, the positioning of Portugal. I mean, would you say that was one of his sort of defining moves, or how he's remembered, that to take that very, 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 what looks to me like a very smart position, to be trading with everybody based on Portugal's natural wealth and raw materials, and only doing deals in gold and boosting up Portugal's gold reserve throughout the Second World War, and hosting people in a neutral way, brokering deals. Is that a correct understanding I've got there of how Portugal operated in the Second World War?
Well, it depends on the eye of the beholder. Of course, I'm sure there are people in Portugal who would have preferred the
Yeah.
country to have fought with the Allies.
Yeah.
But yeah, I think he was quite astute. He came to an understanding with Franco in Spain to exercise what became known as bi-collaborative non-alignment. So, in other words, he would cooperate with the Allies, Franco would cooperate with the Axis, and their common goal was to keep the war outside of the Iberian Peninsula. And they were very successful in doing that. I think it was a smart choice because neither Portugal nor Spain were anywhere near prepared to fight a war, especially a modern war. I mean, if you think that Poland went down quickly, you should have seen, you could have imagined Portugal and Spain. Spain was still reeling from the Civil War. Portugal was poor, in spite of the colonies, it was very poor, so it didn't have a particularly relevant military apparatus. So they did what was possible to do diplomatically. I think that was the only way to go, really.
And almost make a virtue of it. Incredible. Absolutely amazing. So we will do a little bit more sort of constitutional stuff, and then we will go to the inevitable cynicism that the public have. And there are some spicy questions about how politicians are viewed. And I know we had a little bit of conversation before we came on air about how critical Portuguese people, openly critical Portuguese people are about politics, cynical, sometimes browbeaten, you might say. But we'll come to that sort of more social aspect of it in a little while. Andy, yes, he probably is the most political person here, apart from yourself. He made a good, or he asked a little question that I want to come back to about the constitution here. It is technically, here we go. Portugal is still constitutionally a socialist state, I believe. Is that correct?
No. What the constitution does say is that fascist parties are banned. And so many people call Portugal socialist for that reason, because they've banned fascism, but not communism or socialism or anything like that. But it's not formally a socialist state. It's socialist in the sense that it has a social security system, but it's not a socialist by ideology. Even though I would agree that it is, but not constitutionally.
Excellent. Okay. And the other part of this, of course, which we haven't mentioned in terms of how laws are created in a country and how that works alongside the political chamber. Victoria from Atlanta, Georgia, is asking and saying to you, hi, Miguel, what is the process for law creation? And I notice as well, many politicians in Portugal seem to come from the law industry, if I might call it that, or law.
Oh, yes. They're usually lawyers. Plenty of engineers as well, but mostly lawyers. They tend to be. Well, listen, it's a parliamentary system. So MPs, political parties, they have the initiative power when it comes to passing laws, proposing laws. I would say, though, at this point, to be perfectly frank, the most important laws come from the government. Government decrees are the ones that are the most relevant, even if they have to be approved by the president, depending on the subject matter. But the parliament takes forever to debate laws, discuss laws, improve laws. The government just does it, and the executive power is very strong. It's a very centralized country politically.
Okay, and it's certainly we've seen this, haven't we, in the last year, where law has been created very quickly, and if not law, then sort of state of emergency directives, and yes. it would appear that has to be run past the president for his rubber stamping and approval. How real and true is that, or is it more of a saber rattling and kind of bureaucratic thing where he just needs to offer his view? Does he have a lot of executive power to overturn these things?
Oh, he does.
Oh, okay.
But this particular president is not particularly keen to exercise that power.
And why would that be?
That's his platform. That's his choice. He's not a combative president. We've had combative presidents. The one that I showed you, the one that won the first election, 76, he became prime minister. Later on, he became president. And then we had a time in the 90s where we had a PSD government and a PS president, and he was very combative. Another instance notorious of presidential power being exercised was the 2003 invasion of Iraq. Portugal had a PSD-CDS coalition government, so a right-wing government, and they were keen to collaborate with the Americans and send troops to Iraq. President was socialist and said no. So no troops were sent to Iraq, and that was that.
Amazing. Okay, so that is possible. That's fascinating because the and only being here for 3 years, I've only seen Marcelo's tenure and kind of extended that to how all presidents might operate. But it's very interesting to hear that the president can get stuck in if they wish to and overturn things, and that sounds like a really healthy and good dynamic to have in a country's politics. Or does it make it more messy and difficult?
Well, it depends. It depends. I would say it's been working relatively well since the revolution. At least, let's put it this way. Apart from the dictatorship, this is the most stable regime that Portugal has seen in centuries. So you don't have revolutions or overthrows of governments, on and off. So it's a relatively stable system. Seems to work relatively well. But of course, it depends a great deal on the personalities of the people involved.
Yes,
But,
yes,
there's a certain balance of power.
Yes, and world events, of course, and the general global context, and I'm sure we will come to that to talk about the influence of the EU and the European Union and European politics on how Portugal performs as well. So you've given us a fantastic introduction there. I think we're better off in knowing who the parties are. Do keep your questions coming in here to Miguel Silva, who's very kindly joined us to do a Portuguese Politics for Beginners show this morning. Long overdue. We should, as people coming or interested in living in this country, I think we should know this stuff. Victoria says, who are the players and how do they work? So we've done that, or not work together. So, and I think we've given that a pretty good analysis. It's been a stable picture since the election that you shared with us there. Is there any more to say on that, though, in terms of long-standing bitterness between parties, or have we said enough on that? It works fairly well, as good as politics might work in any country.
Well, I was waiting for us to discuss the current situation because things, of course, changed a great deal in the past few years, and that's where I suppose seize the opportunity to explain the different rivalries and alliances, or rivalries.
Perfect.
So
please.
it's up to you.
Yeah, absolutely. Let's do that.
Okay. So I would say the system that I was showing you worked relatively well up until the past decade. Past decade, things started to spin a little bit out of control. So let's see.
We are getting greetings from Germany, where it's snowing, where one of our exiled politicians was, as Miguel told us earlier on this morning. So yes, good morning to you, Jim McDonald over there. A fist for the Bloco already this morning, which is interesting. Bon dia from Sue Hayward this morning. And yeah, we'll come to this, Paul. All politicians from all countries only lie when they open their mouth. So yeah, we'll come to the more sort of street level stuff or the pub talk in just a moment. But yes, okay. So who do we have here, Miguel?
This is the leaders of PSD and PS in 2009.
Okay.
So I would say things were relatively stable. Let me just go back to the previous. So these are previous one. This is the system as it existed up until the 2000s. Normally, the PPD or PSD would coalesce with CDS when it needed additional MPs to form a government. Or the alternative was PS ruling alone. So it alternated between these two solutions, basically. There was a tacit understanding that the far left, the communists and the Trotskyists, would never be allowed to rule because they were too extreme. But all that ended in the past decade. Mm-hmm. So I would say this is an important year, 2009, because for the first time, you had a true ideological divide between PS and PSD. So the man on the left is the former Prime Minister Socrates, He was the socialist prime minister, and on the right was his challenger, a woman, a former finance minister, then leader of PSD, called Frederik. And she was pro-austerity. He was against austerity. And in 2009, after Socrates' first term, he won re-election. He was given another term, and that's when the crisis hit. So in 2009, 2010, and his solution was what he designated as neo-Keynesian economics. In other words, now that the country is in crisis, we as government have to spend money so as to revive the economy. But of course, all that did was to explode the public debt, and eventually leading to bankruptcy and to the intervention of the Troika, of the IMF, the EU, the European Central Bank. I would say this was a defining moment, because after that, tensions became very, very alive again after decades of, let's say, stability. Mm. So we see here the results in the next election, 2011. PSD and CDS together won, but they had a relative majority. They didn't have an absolute majority. And that was how the system worked. The socialists would not overthrow the government, would not bring down the government, because they would recognize that they had, didn't have enough MPs. And that would have been the case again in 2015, except that the now Prime Minister, Costa, decided that he would basically ally himself with the far left to bring down the PSD-CDS government. And therefore, he broke tradition. He stopped the tradition that we had of allowing governments to rule with a relative majority, basically.
Okay, and what were the implications of that ongoing from there?
Well, this Socrates, prime minister, was very, very, very divisive. Not only because he bankrupted the country, but because he exercised power very, very, I don't want to say authoritarian way, but he was very vertical in the way he exercised power. The current president at the time was the most famous, most influential political pundit, and he had to move from one television channel to another because his comments, his analysis was heavily criticized by the government, and the TV channel was pressured into firing him, facilitating a change. So he was very centralizing in the way he exercised power, Socrates. So the right was enraged at him because he had bankrupted the country, because he had tried to control the media. And on top of all of this, shortly after he lost the elections in 2011, he was also arrested on corruption charges, because apparently there were millions of euros passing through his bank accounts, whereas he's obviously not a rich man. So because of all of this, the right-wing parties and the right-wing voters, they couldn't stand the socialists. The socialists, I think, should be blamed because they never did a mea culpa. They never distanced themselves from Socrates. And then the problem was that the left as well felt very offended, let's put it that way, by the austerity years. Yes. Because even though Portugal had had economic crisis before, the 2007-2009 Great Recession was worse. And they were incensed that how could the government even dare make cuts or freeze, careers in the civil servant sector, in the public sector. It was outrageous for them. So that's where I think things started to go a bit off the rails. So for that reason, there was this strong incentive, strong zeitgeist for the left to be united, even though, technically speaking, PS had a lot more in common with PSD than they did with the left bloc. But the result was that in 2015, the CDS-PSD coalition won the elections. They were the most voted political force. But Costa just went to the left bloc and the communists, and they had a parliamentary agreement. And basically, the far left votes in favor of socialist budgets, and they vote against right-wing budgets, and that's how the socialists remain in power.
And that was an upset at that time, and has continued to be the way forward politically in this country.
It is what is internationally known as the contraption. We in Portugal have a more difficult word for it, but it means contraption. It means that no one ever expected it to last very long, precisely because the Socialist Party and the far left didn't have, at the time at least, very much in common. But apparently they do, and they still do today.
Amazing. And yes, and presumably they just become more and more comfortable bedfellows because they enjoy political power and they're able to see through their political aims.
Yes, and I think that the problem with PS is that the PS went through a bit of a crisis, like most socialist parties did after the fall of the Soviet Union, because suddenly socialism was, in America it was always not very popular, but in Europe it was quite popular. Social democracy was very popular. But when socialism collapsed in the Soviet bloc, at least economically, the debate was lost for the socialists. And so over the years, the way that they've survived is through, I would say, just basically populism, trying to gather votes through campaign promises, like most politicians do. But in terms of, in symbolic ideological terms, they would borrow a number of causes from the far left, from the left bloc. So gay marriage and euthanasia and abortion rights and that sort of thing. Not those things, change things in the country a great deal, but they're symbolic. And so they would borrow those from the far left. So obviously, at this point in time, the truth is, there aren't that many differences between PS and the left bloc. What I think surprised the right was that the left bloc would be willing to support a government that was part of NATO, who participated in NATO missions, who maintained the euro, who still maintains austerity, even though they were elected to end austerity. Austerity is still there, and perhaps not for the civil servants, but certainly for the rest of the country. Taxes have not come down. I mean, the restrictive measures are still there. But I suppose it's all about the narrative.
It is all about the narrative. This is what we know now, isn't it? And this is a familiar picture. So there's a progressive, a sense of a progressive alliance moving the country forward in one sense, with issues and political ideas that you would want to be associated with as a modern country. So that's one driving force in politics, isn't it? Then there is this undercurrent of bitterness about austerity and the crash. I don't think that the country really recovered from, and then that's gone into the pandemic to make it even worse. And I don't think we've really seen the full. Well, we're not there yet, but we're not aware, I think, of what's coming in terms of adding insult to injury from austerity into an economic crisis caused by the pandemic. So then you have Portugal on the one hand being a poster boy and current chair, I think, of the European Commission at the moment, or EU. Sorry, I'm not familiar with which organization Portugal is chair of, but it enjoys, as far as I can see, a kind of poster boy image of what the European ideals are about. And as long as you are a poster boy in Europe and you're doing the right thing, you are going to receive your funding and support from the EU. So there's those three things. And then, of course, like everywhere else, there's also the rise of populism in politics, and polarization in politics. All the issues are no longer nuanced. It's like, are you with us? Are you against us? Are you red or are you blue? And everything ends up as 52 or 48%. Is that an accurate analysis of, taking on board what you said and what my understanding is? Is that where we are right now, or have I missed something from that picture?
The thing about peripheral countries like Portugal is that everything arrives late here, but we still, I think, do not escape the larger trends. And certainly when it comes to the realignment of the political spectrum in the West, it's coming to Portugal as well. Perhaps I can share some more interesting.
Yeah, sure. Bring that to the screen then, Miguel, and I'll just catch us up with a few comments. We've got a fantastic crowd in this morning, an erudite and learned crowd who are telling us things like Duarte Pio is the leader of the once royal family and was married in Portugal in 1995. So there's an amazing sort of historical tolerance of the royal family, it would appear. World War II and Portugal's role. Recommend the novel by Robert Wilson, A Small Death in Lisbon. That sounds that should be on the reading list of any serious expat. Read World War II. That's the same message there. Thank you. And he loves that book so much. He's posted that 3 times. A book I recommend, another book here for the reading list. People should read Lisbon, War in the Shadows of the City of Light. Of course, yes, City of Light, Lisbon, 1939 to 1945. Thank you for that, Joel. You've been remarkably restrained with your political sharing this morning, but I haven't scrolled down that far yet. Preamble to Constitution. The Constituent Assembly affirms the Portuguese people's decision to defend national independence, guarantee citizens' fundamental rights, establish, and it goes on. And that's why I think Doc loves the politics here so much, or aspects of it anyway, or the basis of it. Good morning from a foggy Malveira. The 2015 legislative elections provided a shock result, with the relative majority obtained by the right-wing coalition actually celebrating their win and preparing to rule, being defeated by an unprecedented union of the remaining centre and left parties. Thank you very much for that, Marco. Oh, and this is the bit we were missed from what Andy was sharing. Establish a socialist state. And I guess, were you saying there that that's not so much a political statement, more of an aspirational, sociological statement, to be socialistic rather than socialist, possibly?
Yes, Portugal was not a people's republic. That's what I meant.
Okay, that's simply put. Did you want to share something on the screen, Miguel? I haven't got it at this end.
Yes, just on the topic of books, I would say perhaps the most relevant and most famous book of Portugal during the war is Casino Royale.
Of course it is. Of course it is. And it has not gone unnoticed that you would make quite an interesting character in a Bond film yourself. I don't know if you saw that. Well, look, can you please ask Miguel to say, come, Mr. Bond, you derive much pleasure from killing as I do. Maybe we can get you to do that towards the end. I don't know. But you make a really interesting connection there with Casino Royale and Ian Fleming, of course, being in Portugal in the Second World War, as I understand it. In Estoril, absolutely, and his that famous character Tricycle, the Russian spy, I think, who was called Tricycle because he was always with 2 girls. Interestingly,
okay.
I don't know if that's an urban myth, probably is, but a good question from the Indigo Escape. How usually are the president and the prime minister from different parties? Is that the dynamic? Are they usually from opposite parties or different
Very
parties?
frequently, yes.
Yes. Okay. Excellent. This is a fantastic conversation. Thanks, Sue. I'm really enjoying the education this morning. Yes, but only if he has enough compelling arguments to make an early vote. That's we need a bit of context with that one. So the Constitution lays out an intention to establish a socialist society. Andy, not letting it lie there, and enjoying this a great deal with his socialist and socialistic values. From Portugal, Vota Chega. So the first declaration of a directive here, I think, from a Portuguese person, Se queres mudar. What does that mean, Se queres mudar?
If you want change, vote.
If you want change, Chega. Okay. We will obviously we can't have a political discussion here without mentioning Chega. So it just happened organically this time. I'm under the impression they are currently from 2 different parties. Yeah. Yes, that's true. Yes, he does. It's what we usually call the atomic bomb. Is that the atomic bomb as in the 2 from being from different sides, I wonder? We are at the moment reading a book recommended to us called The First Global Village, How Portugal Changed the World by Martin Page. This is great. So many excellent resources this morning. Feel free, please, Miguel, to share on the screen if there was something else you wanted there. And your comment, I found this fascinating. Je say Socrates, an engineer with a degree taken on a Sunday when all the universities are closed. All right, but let's say he is an engineer. Lawyers and engineers. I mean, that's such a fascinating combination and an insight into the psyche of politics in Portugal in its own way, I think. Beyond the EU, where are Portugal's alliances and or influences? Excellent question to address as well. And lots of comments coming in. So, Miguel, did you want to share something on the screen there?
Yeah. So this is an interesting image, which shows the first image is the so this is the results of the last presidential election. The first image is the candidate that received the most votes. So overwhelmingly, the current president won in every district of Portugal.
Wow.
Now, the interesting pictures are the other two, which is the second most voted candidate. And there we have a significant change. So the system is upended because the little pink color is in the districts where the Socialist Party candidate won. That would be normal. Marcelo is formally the candidate of PSD, the center-right party. But the dark blue color is the candidate from Chega, from that Enough party, which is one of the new parties that made it into parliament in 2019. So that is a big change.
Absolutely.
And because not only because that party exists, but in the space of 1 year, it managed to basically gather votes from a considerable part of the population. In the last presidential elections, this new party that we're discussing gathered about 500,000 votes. So for a party which is 1 year old, that's incredible. That's significant. And so I have here an image of the new parties, and perhaps we can discuss those.
Please, yeah, absolutely.
So the socialists are on the left, so followed by the Social Democrats. That's the ones we knew until now. Then we have Chega, the Enough party. They came in at third place in the presidential elections. The left bloc we already know. Then we have the Liberal Initiative, also a new party. PAN, People, Animals and Nature, was elected back in 2015, but they're still in parliament now. And then on the very far right is the Free Party, or Livre, which is also a far left party, basically a secession from the left bloc. So we have now 9 parties in parliament where there used to be 5. So things are changing very quickly. Chega is basically a conservative party. And this is new because until now, the right wing did not dare to be openly conservative, or at least openly anti-socialist, put it that way. Yeah. They prefer to disguise themselves a bit as, center-right, centrist. Chega is unabashedly right-wing conservative. The Liberal Initiative, I would say they're rather centrist because they have very radical privatization proposals for the economy, but on the other hand, their social values are very similar to those of the left bloc. So it's an odd mix. People, Animals and Nature is basically an environmentalist party, and Livre is an alternative to the left bloc. It has a complicated history. I'm not sure it's worthwhile going into that, but well, they only have 1 MP. They used to have 1 MP. Now they're split. Anyway, it's a complicated history.
Okay, so we've gone from 5 to 9, and this can make things hard to work in politics. Obviously, the more parties there are, it splits the vote, and then the traditional parties have an easier job in many ways, don't they, with what's left? I have so many questions, but so do other people as well. And this is a good point, I think, to ask this one from Victoria. Are the Portuguese politicians bringing the people what they want? So we look at that spread of 9 parties there. You would think so, wouldn't you? In other words, are they representing their constituents well? How would you answer that? I mean, what are levels of satisfaction, and what's your personal view on that?
Historically speaking, they are the very lowest that they've been in decades. People don't trust politicians. They don't trust the political system. Cafe conversations invariably revolve around calling politicians corrupt.
Yeah.
So no, I think I would say trust in the political system is at an all-time low, and I think partly that's why you see all these new parties being elected.
Okay, and in a sense, it's to try and build. I was going to use that dreaded political phrase, build back confidence. I mean, there's another thing we might talk about. You know, the sort of global agenda of the Great Reset and where Portugal might fit into that, which to me is a little chilling. But anyway, somebody may wish to bring that up. But here we have what looks like greater representation, yet faith and belief and trust in governments at an all-time low. So you've given us a historical analysis. We're we're up to date now here. We you know, I've articulated what I think is going on, you know, in terms of still smarting from austerity and a worse economic situation to come. How are you seeing the future in terms of how the political parties are positioning themselves at the moment, and based on your historical understanding of Portuguese politics? And I know it's punditry and I know it's crystal ball stuff, but there's probably nobody better than you and some of the people gathered here to make a call on that, Miguel, if you wouldn't mind.
So the image that we're seeing now is of a poll that was conducted after the presidential elections, and we see here the most voted parties in that poll. Socialist Party and PSD traditionally being the larger parties, they're still there. Chega is the big news because it's a very, very new, very conservative party, and they're in third place in that poll. Following the left bloc, you have the Liberal Initiative, again, very much in favor of privatization. And I would just like to provide the context, the justification of why things are the way they are.
Please.
The truth was that the PSD leadership, following the controversial Socrates years, was not seen by the right-wing voters to provide much of an alternative, and much of an opposition to the socialists. And so basically, when the current leader of PSD was elected, many people just left the party. They couldn't stomach supporting PSD anymore. And so the liberals went and formed the Liberal Initiative, conservatives formed Chega, and that's how you have these two very strong parties, because normally PSD would be a bit more of a rival to PS, but at this point they're falling behind. And it's mostly because of these secessions, let's say. The Free Party, or the very smallest party, is, I think, basically, in my opinion, there because the left bloc supports the socialists, and the left bloc used to be the center of the protest vote on the left. But since they support the government anyway, then the protest vote has to go somewhere, and it's going towards Leave. Well, it did in the last election. We'll see how it turns out in the next one. Where do I see things going? I'm not sure, because whereas it's true that these small parties are growing, it's you know, depending on how you look at it, the growth is incremental. So I don't know that they will be strong enough in the next elections to remove the socialists from power. But one of the few changes that they have managed to operate was in the Azores. Now, the Azores and Madeira are autonomous regions, so they have certain powers. They have regional parliaments as well, very small ones, but they're there. And the socialists ruled the Azores for decades alone. That bred a whole, you know, brought them many allegations of corruption, but well, people kept voting for them. And now, for the first time, because of these new right-wing parties, they were able to create a sort of a contraption of their own in the Azores. So even though Chega and the Liberal Initiative are not part of the regional government, PSD and CDS rule Azores with their regional parliamentary support. So things are starting to change. I don't know if they will change considerably in the next election, but they're starting to change. And of course, one of the mysteries that remains is what will happen to PS and PSD to a certain extent. But PSD, we see that their voters are changing things. With PS, it's a bit of a mystery because in the rest of Europe, socialist parties are not doing very well. In France, they've suffered considerably. In Greece, they ceased to exist. In Portugal, it's still the strongest party. So the question remains, for how long?
Mm. Fascinating commentary, Miguel. Thank you. I would echo that absolutely, and I hope we can continue to talk for a little bit more. We have an excellent attention span in our community here of Good Morning Portugal on expatsportugal.com. The debate is lost with capitalism. Look at the debt levels in the USA. On one level, I get you, Doc, and any Marxist would say that, wouldn't they? That, look at the state that these capitalist countries are in, but people still seem to have quite a faith, or they're on a treadmill with it anyway. So whilst the debate may be lost, the everyday reality of capitalism seems to trundle on just fine. When did the contraption begin is a question from Mark. It is interesting that Portugal's fiscal policy has diverged from much of the West, but has been successful in relative terms. Yeah, I mean, it has its own unique way of doing the general theme of Western democracy and politics, doesn't it? So when did the contraption begin?
2015.
That was 2015 when it started. Okay, and why could you say more about this? The Portuguese take or flavour on. I mean, let's face it. All of the states of the EU are various sort of neoliberal enterprises, aren't they? Trying to do capitalism in their best way and be socially democratic and kick things down the street. The full-on results of the previous austerity, what's coming with the pandemic, what's happening with debt levels. That's usually given to future governments, isn't it, rather than sorted out by the government in place at any time. So there's that those time bombs are ticking away, all of them. But what's Portugal's unique take on that? Would you characterize it as the contraption?
Well, I can describe the contraption. I don't. The unique take is only political. It's not financial. Financial, it's in the same situation as the other countries. It's worse. I mean, until this year, until a month or two ago, Portugal was in the top 10 of the world's most indebted economies. So it's a disaster zone. But because it keeps getting bailed out by the EU, it goes on. But no, it's not doing well at all. As for the contraption, I think it has to do with the fact that we had a very, very left-wing flavored revolution. And so many people, I think that most citizens in most countries don't particularly care about politics. They only do when they really have to. Yes. And in the revolution, everyone had to. So their political education was the revolution. So for many people in Portugal, especially the baby boomers, their political values are left-wing simply out of context. And so the austerity measures, I think, were a shock to many people because the government's basic job, in their eyes, is to provide people with stuff. It's to provide them with social security and healthcare and education. And so if there are cuts to those sectors, and in some cases unprecedented cuts, then that's outrageous. That's shocking. And I think it was this outrage that was also driven a great deal by the intellectual class and by academia and by politicians and by journalists that basically imposed the contraption. I think on the part of the left bloc, especially, and the communists, there was a bit of a rhetorical entrapment because they had argued so much, they had used such an hysterical rhetoric against the austerity governments of the right that they really couldn't possibly justify not supporting the socialists when they were finally given the opportunity to revert the policies of the austerity governments. So they couldn't back down at that point. And in part, it is that fear, that rhetorical entrapment that still drives them. Because the truth is, the communists and the left bloc have been losing votes. And this is critical in some aspects. Say, for example, in presidential elections, you need to get a certain percentage of the votes in order for the state to pay for the campaign, to subsidize the campaign. Below a certain threshold, you don't get any money. And this has happened to both the communists and now with the left bloc in these past elections, that they really are very, very much on the verge. They run the risk of not getting any funding from the presidential election. So they run candidates, and these candidates do extremely badly. And it's not a coincidence. It's partly the effect of Marcelo. Marcelo is supposedly a right-wing leader, but honestly, he rules as if he were a PS president, in my view. But it's also partly the fact that there is no distinction between the left bloc and the Communist Party relatively to the PS, because they support their budgets. You know, one of the things that the right mocks is that the left bloc in the morning goes to Parliament to vote the Socialist Party budget. In the afternoon, it comes out to the streets to demonstrate against that budget. It's completely hypocritical, and of course, this has effects.
Incredible, incredible. I think that's so fascinating, Miguel, about the baby boomers being of the left in Portugal, because I think elsewhere in the world, the baby boomers have done extremely well from neoliberalism and capitalism. You know, most notably their personal assets, their house has gone up massively in value. They've all become, little capitalists, haven't they? And they've enjoyed that sense, because that speaks to people. But to think and know that the Portuguese had their political education from the revolution in our fairly recent history is really inspiring. I was getting chills when you were talking about that there may be a socialistic consciousness among the older generation here because of that sudden education they had from the revolution. That's absolutely fascinating. I think that's another thing that makes Portugal a little bit different. Let's talk a little bit more about Chega, if we might. I think the gist you were making, and this answers your earlier question, I think, Gary, about the influence of the left and how, generally speaking, we are political, not political systems, but politics itself is in this slow creep to the right, isn't it? Center to right, and that's what works for the EU. That seems to be the steady creep. Certainly, my experience of the UK is that's what's happening. You don't recognise the left anymore because it's moved so far to the centre and gone over that line that it's social democracy with a right lean on it. That's what the left has become in a popular sense, and hence then the openness and desperation, or whatever you might characterise the rise of Chega. Enough. Change. These political movements come out, don't they? When people feel understandably frustrated, it tends to give birth to this sort of political. I'm going to call it a political outburst. Is Gary right in thinking that Chega have a more nationalistic agenda? Could you tell us more? Could you answer that and tell us more about Chega and its popularity and its ongoing popularity here in Portugal and its influence in the mix?
Yes. So I think they have a more nationalistic agenda. I think the problem is that are they nationalistic? Yes. I think the problem is that other parties are becoming less nationalistic, and that leads people who are patriotic to feel in the first moment confused, in the second moment outraged. I will show you some of the things that drive the Chega vote. And the right-wing vote in alternative parties in general. We spoke of the contraption. Part of the reason is the fact that PS behaved very poorly in these few years, and they didn't suffer any consequences from that. In fact, they're being rewarded because they keep ruling, they keep forming governments. And in Portugal, there is much talk in the media of a cordon sanitaire, a wall, a dam to keep Chega out, the fascistic populace. But there is no stigma associated with PS, which had a very corrupt prime minister, which bankrupted the country, which that broke tradition and formed the contraption. And this had all sorts of implications. So, for example, the parliament in Portugal is called the Assembly of the Republic, and the assembly has a president, just someone to moderate the debate in parliament. And that person was traditionally chosen amongst the bigger parties, and it was traditionally someone who was not controversial. precisely because they had to moderate between everyone in parliament. So they had to be someone who's fairly consensual. But the current president of the assembly is someone who is incredibly divisive, who is very rude. He was caught in a few decades ago in a secret recording, basically saying that whoever messes with PS, gets hit. They're very arrogant, very divisive, and this is the person that PS chooses to represent them and to preside over Parliament. They've been doing things, and the problem is, if we could say, well, PS has good politicians and bad politicians. Yes, Socrates was a bad politician, but now everything's different. No, it's the same people that used to be in the Socrates government that are there. The people who defended him when he was arrested, they're there.
Yes.
Costa was Socrates #2.
And this matters to everyday people, doesn't it? They don't forget stuff like that.
Well,
and quite rightly.
I can tell you this much. I think it matters to a right-wing electorate at least. Yes. I don't know what centrists and left-wing people think, but at the very least, for the right-wing, this is egregious. How can this be? And so I'll share some more images of, I would say, problems that the right views with the system at the moment.
Yes.
We'll go from there. So you see, this is one of the problems that we had recently, the 100th anniversary of the Communist Party, and you had communist flags all over the country. You could never even dream of having anything remotely like this for any right-wing party. I mean, this is incredible. In the European Parliament, for example, they have votes in which they condemn communism and fascism. And in Portugal, the parliament, led by PS, refuses to endorse those votes. So they do not condemn communism. They have no problems condemning fascism, of course, but not communism. So this is one of the things that incenses the right. Yes. Here are articles of when Socrates was arrested. He's still on trial, by the way. And people's guess at the moment is that he will walk because the statute of limitations will eventually expire. And he's been tried, but they never get around to have the trial, and so eventually it will expire and he will walk. That's what people suspect will happen.
That would appear to be the corruption playbook, though, right? We're not the only country seeing that here. Long trial, keep kicking it down the street. Maybe people will forget.
Yes.
Yeah.
That's at least that's what people on the right suspect is happening. I'm not going to say one way or the other, but that's what that's the impression that they get. Yeah. And here we have a number of headlines of things that I think are just outraging the right. I'm sorry they're all in Portuguese, but I will try and
I need to apologize. We get a sense.
So you're saying Chega is nationalistic. So why is Chega perceived as nationalistic? You have this image of a statue on the right. There's also a statue here in the middle on the left. And these are statues that have been vandalized. There are other monuments that have been vandalized by left-wing activists because basically they look at Portuguese history, traditionally seen that, Portuguese are very proud of that history. But they vandalize these statues of historical figures because they were all colonialist and racist and so on and so forth. And I think this is at the very least, disconcerting for the right. You have this little man on top in Parliament. He advocates for the demolition of the Monument of the Discoveries in Lisbon. Again, because history is problematic. Still on top, you have the mayor of Lisbon. He advocates for the banning of Chega as a political party. So he doesn't want. He thinks that Chega is beyond the pale. On below him, we have this lady from this influential NGO who's always being interviewed, and she says that racism does not exist from blacks to whites. It's only whites who can be racist. On the left, we have this news report of a conference in Nova University, which was basically censored. It was a right-wing conference with right-wing intellectuals, and because of pressure from the students' union, I believe, the conference was cancelled, pure and simple. Below that, we have one of the members of government, of the Costa government, saying that they want to monitor hate speech on the internet. Of course, hate speech means basically right-wing speech. And below is one of the recent news. These honor students, some of the best students in a certain school, they were not allowed to move on. So past the year, I'm not sure how put that in English, because their parents refused to allow them in what we say are citizenship lessons, citizenship
Oh yes,
courses.
Yes.
So civic education, I'm not sure how but the problem is that in civic education, of course, they have a certain amount of now these days left-wing ideological values being taught, and so many conservative parents are not particularly fond of that. And actually, until recently, I don't know how it is now, but these courses were not mandatory. So I don't know if they are now, but the socialist deputy minister for education was trying to signed an order to flunk them, to prevent them from moving on in school. And so there was a big outrage. I think they were eventually allowed to proceed, but just the fact that a government minister deputy minister would do this, would interfere directly with a school and for ideological reasons, it's unprecedented. But so these are some of the things that incense the right. And because PSD doesn't seem to do much or be particularly concerned about these things, parties like Chega are growing.
Yeah, and you say parties like, I mean, so they're not alone. There are other right-wing parties
Chega had a number of advantages. One is that its leader used to be a pundit, sports pundit, but still he was on TV, he was known. So that brought with it recognition. And the other advantage is that they were some of the first to and he used to be in PSD himself. So most of the people who vote and who are members of Chega, and disclaimer, I am a member of Chega. Right. But so I don't want people to think that I'm completely unbiased. But most of the members of Chega come from PSD and CDS. They come from the right, and so they had a certain experience in politics, in Portuguese politics already. That was the advantage. Now, there are many other right-wing movements that are trying to become parties, but of course it's always very difficult to get the signatures and the funding, and so they're not parties yet.
Wow. Okay. And I feel thank you for your authenticity, your transparency and openness there. I didn't ask you what your political views were before, and I think it's fascinating. And I have this immediate sort of journalistic. I actually don't see myself as a journalist, but I have this immediate journalistic. Oh, I need to get someone else on another time to balance up the extreme Miguel Silva from Chega. And I say that tongue in cheek because these are emotional political times, aren't they? You are saying you have some support for what is characterized as an extreme party, and I don't suppose you would deny that extreme people are attracted to Chega, but you can't help that with political. You can't help that with a political party. Now, I'm in. Somebody I've had a man-to-man with here, and other people have been talking with you and learning a lot about politics, and you're an extremely sort of learned and educated person in politics. My immediate reception, my immediate question or reaction is like, what's a smart guy like you doing in Chega? And again, I don't mean that in a bad, you see what I'm getting at here. It's characterized in a way that that fits this whole sort of narrative of outrage, one side to the other, extremism, and so on. I want to ask you that man to man. So what is it that appeals to you about Chega? And that's coming from my a little bit of surprise, and also not very understanding, as I said right from the get-go here, not understanding Portuguese politics very well. So what is it for you personally then that attracts you to Chega?
Well, I think that the mainstream media narrative does not often correspond to reality. So, Chega is seen as basically a crypto-fascist party. Again, most of its members came from PSD and CDS. These were not, extreme parties by any measure. And actually, I think they did a poll or a study of some kind last year, and then basically found that there were, proportionately speaking, more people with higher education degrees in Chega than in the bigger parties. So, listen, I'll give you a practical example. CDS used to be seen, not sure now, as the elite party, because many of its members were, they lived in Cascais and Sintra, and they had properties in Alentejo, and they were seen as the rich people's party. Well, guess what? Many of these people came to Chega, so it's not exactly a party of the rabble. It is very popular. It's very popular in rural regions as well. This is true. But by no means is it only a working man's party. There are plenty of educated people and people with means in the party as well.
Absolutely. There would be no question about that. And we do have to be careful, don't we, of the sort of tabloid characterization of anything, especially political parties. So this has been an interesting plot twist for me. This interview must be made to a left-wing analyst, because he, despite being polite, is misrepresenting many aspects of Portuguese politics. I mean, Paula, bring it on. Miguel Silva here has been kind enough to step forward and give us an amazing introduction more generally to Portuguese politics and culture. So I'm so glad you've done that today, Miguel. And, we have an open platform here, so I'm entirely open to what Paulo there might characterize as a more left-wing analyst of politics. But to me, it seems to me like you've given an objective view of politics, and you've been transparent and told me where your political colours are nailed. It might be interesting to have you and the doc on here talking at some point, because, it's a kind of Marmite subject on the one hand, oh no, they're talking about politics on Good Morning Portugal show. It's better when they talk about food and Portuguese wine, and maybe it is. But I think these grown-up, leisurely, respectful conversations are extremely important as well. And I really thank you for stepping forward and being honest about your political persuasions as well. And this sums up for me, what we're about. If you ban or forbid political views parties, then you have taken a step closer to the dictatorship that you oppose. So as uncomfortable as it might be at times, I do think we should have these conversations and invitations to people. Mark says this has been a fascinating presentation and discussion. So much still to learn about Portugal as a newbie living in Portugal. Just with a few concluding comments now. I followed the case of the boys who are going to fail because they did not attend citizenship classes, and what Miguel said is false. So clearly that lends itself to a more, or a matter of opinion certainly, but it lends itself to a more of a panel discussion. And again, I say bring it on. Let's have those debates. It's so important in these politically charged and emotional times that we continue to talk without a doubt and don't dismiss or cut each other off. So I stand for that, absolutely. Michael Hopkins, who I think expressed an unwillingness to engage with NGOs. I think the nationalist patriotism and love of the country has been replaced with the label right wing. Interesting comment, Michael. Thank you. Thank you, Miguel. Miguel, it's interesting for certain. I'd love to hear more, even though I'm far left. Being far left in the US, it's not difficult, is it? Just to even to talk about socialism at all, I imagine makes you far left in some parts of the United States. It's all part of culture, says Sue as well. So On that note, I do thank you for being here, Miguel, with your excellent analysis of Portuguese history, setting the scene for us. And what we got to towards the end there, contemporary politics, where we go from here. When I said when I mentioned the Great Reset earlier on, you gave a knowing nod. You're seeing that as part of the political future and context as we're moving forward from the pandemic?
It depends on what you mean by it. People on the right in Portugal, I can tell you, are very concerned and very skeptical of the term. But it seems to be taken as very natural and very organic by the mainstream media. It depends on what it means. I think from a conservative standpoint, if you are now going to have such things as COVID passports in order to access whichever, traveling, public services, etc., that's very concerning and, in my personal view, unjustified. And so it really does depend. It is very subjective. It's not very well defined, the Great Reset, is it?
No, but with all of these things, it's co-opted to political leaning, isn't it? So if you're a sort of neoliberal centrist, it just seems like a fairly obvious thing to do to build back better and to have a collective globalized future that's good for all people. And through certain optics, which is the word of the moment, isn't it? That could be seen as, yes, we're all sort of one global village, happy people. Let's be socialistic in that sense and create one great big friendly, supportive world. And who wouldn't, on the face of it, want that? Who wouldn't want a united world where there's equity, equality, and people being nice to each other? That's not a difficult sell, is it? But then when you get into the long grass of that and you understand the agendas behind it, I also understand why the right are deeply against such new economic forum, globalist, and to a certain extent the agendas of the EU in this regard. So to me, this is one of the great limitations of the political debate. Positioning ourselves on the political spectrum tends to cause people to deny parts of themselves. This is what I'm seeing going on at the moment. So that's why I'd love to see you and Andy Thompson from our community here have a discussion here, because you would, on many things you would agree in a humanitarian way, but you would entirely disagree in a political way, i.e. the means to bring those humanitarian aims about. And I guess that is what politics is about, and that's why it continues to churn in the way it does. But yeah, amazing today. Sorry, go on.
There was a famous Friedman quote where he said that the tragedy of politics is people interpret politics based on intentions and not on results. And so obviously it all sounds good, but does it all produce good is the important question, I think.
I find myself agreeing with you. I saw a meme only yesterday, which is, along the lines of how's that working out for you? Because I think that's a difficult but excellent question. How is that working out for you, for our personal lives and our political lives? But it's like, are you a good advert of the things you believe in? Because on the one hand, I think we need to do that personally. And then when you scale that up politically, is what we've got, is how we're relating to each other. Are people being cared for? That is the advert for the beliefs that lie at the heart of any political system. And clearly we haven't got it quite right at the moment. And that's why we need to keep talking, I think, in the way that we are. So I thank you very much for being here this morning. Can you recommend a left-wing analyst?
My pleasure. A left-wing analyst who would have a conversation in English. I'll have to think about it. I'll come back to you on that.
Okay, maybe we speak to them, and then maybe we speak to you both at some point in the future. But again, let me say, and on behalf of this community, thank you for stepping forward into our need to understand Portuguese politics better. You've done a great job, and look forward to staying in touch and hearing more. And yes, your recommendation to maybe sort of politically, intellectually balance things up a little bit as well. Miguel, thank you so much. Really appreciate you being here.
Thank you for the opportunity, Carl.